Today I am going to be talking about internet and technology nostalgia. It's partly an answer to the question from Savvy Sexy Social's prompts about what you are nostalgic about from the pre-smartphone era, and it is partly a response to Dallas's Day 6 video, which I will link down below, about the Oregon Trail generation. And I know you're wondering, what is the Oregon Trail generation and why have I not heard of it? Well, the term Oregon Trail generation is coming from an article by Anna Garvey that was on socialmediaweek.org, which I will link to down below. And her article is talking about the folks that were born on the tail end of the Gen X generation and the ramping up of the millennial generation that do not very cleanly fit into either of those generational descriptions, largely due to our unique experience of the transition from not having the internet to having the internet. She calls this generation of people the Oregon Trail generation because largely their first memories of a computer are of an Apple IIe playing Oregon Trail in a classroom somewhere in America. This is a group of folks that are old enough that they have distinct memories of what life was like before the internet, but are still young enough that they were children when the internet was becoming a thing. This is a group of people that is going to have distinct memories of calling their friends on a house phone and talking to their friend's parents before getting to talk to their friend, but at the same time is going to remember IMing their friends on a service like AIM or MSN Messenger. We were the teenagers of the pre-social networking era. We may or may not have been participatory in this. Not everybody was. We might have overshared our lives on sites like Zanga or LiveJournal, or prior to that, possibly Diaryland or DiaryX. Or if you got started on this whole internet sharing a little bit early, you might remember making your journal entries in Notepad and uploading them via an FTP server. You might have built a website on a place called Angelfire or Tripod or GeoCities. Because this whole oversharing thing has totally been a thing for at least 20 years, if not more at this point. I built my first website in 1997. I was 13 years old. That was 20 years ago now. So for my nostalgia, I'm going to tell you about things that teenage girls with websites did at the turn of the century, which may be some long forgotten internet history. So in the late 90s, the popular free hosting sites were Angelfire, Tripod, and GeoCities. So right before the turn of the century, okay, that sounds weird. Anyway, the top three hosting sites were Angelfire, Tripod, and GeoCities. And what they started to do at the tail end of the 90s was monetize. But not monetize in a way that benefited anybody who was hosted on their website. It was monetized to benefit them. So if you had a website on any of these servers, all of a sudden you had really ugly ads for things you didn't care about on your website. So there was this mass exodus that happened. I really don't know how this played out for people who were older than me, but the way it sort of happened for teenage girls that were making websites and were showing some sort of aptitude for being okay at making visually pleasing things was that there were girls that ended up having domain names and hosting, like big kid hosting. Usually it was because they had a dad who worked in tech and bought them a domain name, because domain names at that point were also very expensive. And this phenomenon started to happen amongst teenage girls. And I specifically remember it being a girl thing. There were a few boys that I remember in this little subculture, if you will, but it was mostly a teenage girl thing. Anyway, but what would happen was they would find other girls that they liked their design aesthetic or liked their writing or whatever. It was usually design aesthetic. And they would offer them hosting, which was usually a folder on their server. And Very rarely were they smart enough to create like usernames for people to have their own separate FTP. It was like there was one FTP password and we all uploaded to the same place and you just put your stuff in your folder. So it was very much like a trust exercise with strangers. So these little communities of teenage girls that were making websites started to pop up. And mind you, most of the residents in these little communities were quite transient. They are teenage girls. They were prone to drama and getting into fights, and because usually there was only one password, sometimes someone would get mad and delete all of someone else's stuff that they didn't like, or just decide that, like, oh, I don't like this person anymore, I'm going to kick them off my domain, and they would have to find hosting somewhere else. Or sometimes you would just move because you decided that you liked this other person better. And what do these websites consist of generally? Usually, a teenage girl's personal website tended to have a journal where they talked about really angsty things from their lives. It often had a section that was rants about stuff they didn't like, or politics, or whatever their understanding of that was at the time. You probably had a page of links to other teenage girls who made websites. If you were particularly angsty, you might have included a link there to a website called Bert is Evil. And if you were especially gothy, you may have included a changing image that was kind of an early webcomic called Crack or Gel. And then you have the pages of clicks and fan listings. Let me explain. So in the late 90s, there were a number of different ways to find websites that were similar to yours. It started out with the web ring, which was really complicated. It was a script that you would hit and put a code on your website, which was generally really ugly unless you knew enough code to make it beautiful. You'd hit next, and it would go to the next website that was in the ring. And or you could hit random, and it would go to a random website. But a lot of the times, the web ring would break because websites would disappear all the time, or they would become porn. So the concept of the web ring kind of fell by the wayside, and there were these things that sprung up in its place, and they were called clubs, clicks, or fan listings. And there's a slight distinction between the three. The club was kind of the earliest iteration of this concept, and usually what that included was a mailing list of some sort and a list on the club's website of all of the members of the club, and you got a little link that you would put on your website to link back to the club you were in. It either had a mailing list, or if it was a really advanced one, it would have a listserv, and you could have a little discussion list thing going on. And clubs were sort of happening at the same time as a web ring. A club very often had a web ring. So that eventually gave way to the click, which was a much simpler concept. And the click was kind of what you would expect it to be. It was a website that had a criteria that you needed to meet, and what would happen was you would submit your website to join the click, and if the owner of the click liked your website, you would be added to a list of members where you could look at the list and click on the other people's websites, and then you would have to put a little code on your website to link back to the click to say you were a member of that click. And some people were kind of click addicts, because the more clicks you were in, the more people who were going to possibly see your website. And as you would expect, some clicks were exclusive and some clicks took everybody. But that was a way that your website was often found by people who were kind of like you. And then a little bit later on, fan listings happened. And surprisingly, the fanlistings.org still exists. And what those were kind of what you would expect. They were very much like clicks in the sense that they were a list of links, but in this case it wasn't an exclusive thing, it was just you needed to be a fan of this particular actor, movie, TV show, food, whatever. And often teenage girls had entire sections of their websites that they built to display the buttons that came from these clubs and clicks and fan listings. And towards the end of it, they did create scripts to help do that, but for the most part, that was all hand-coded links, and it was kind of a bitch to manage because these things came and disappeared at the blink of an eye. And then slowly into the early 2000s, the entire hosted thing began to die out. And that had a lot to do with the fact that that was when your first blogging platforms started arriving on the scene. LiveJournal and Blogger and Zonga. And a lot of people migrated to using that because that made it a lot easier for people who were not super tech savvy to join in. And places like LiveJournal had friends only posts, so there was some moderation type things that you could do. And there was always some people who stayed it public and had their eventually got their own domains. But so I think that kind of covers nostalgia from the pre-smartphone age. I think that also covers nostalgia from the pre-social media age and the pre-blogging age. So I'm gonna stop that there because I think we're at 10 minutes. And let me know in the comments what you were doing on the internet at the turn of the century. Bye!